Greetings, my excellent friends, and welcome to Pro Photo Tips. My name is Josh Cripps, and you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Joshua Cripps Photography. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how I process my Milky Way photos. Now, this is a multi-part video where I'm going to be showing you, in this part, how I process my single exposure Milky Way photos, and in the subsequent parts, I'm going to be showing you how I combine two photos, one that I took around dusk with one that I took in the middle of the night to get the best possible image quality. So be sure to check out all the parts of the video. For my Milky Way processing, there are always 5 critical areas that I like to look at. Those are exposure, color, contrast, detail, noise, and tuning the tones of the photo, the shadows, and the highlights. So I'm going to be walking you through all 5 of those critical areas in this video. So let's go ahead and dive on in. For all of my processing, there's a couple of things that I like to double check before I even get started. So let's do the same here. First of all, jump down to your camera calibration, and I like to make sure I'm in camera flat. If you don't have that, you might have something like camera neutral or camera faithful. It gives me the most basic starting point to begin from for my edits. I also want to go up here to my lens correction to make sure remove chromatic aberration is ticked. So let's go ahead and dive in to the first of those particular areas, the exposure. If you look at my histogram, you can see that it is quite dark. I don't actually have any clipped shadows, but almost all of my detail is below middle gray. Now this is a night photo, so it's okay if things are a little bit dark. However, I would like to bring out the Milky Way and some of the detail in these two towers a little bit. So I'm going to increase my exposure, and instead of doing it like I would for a normal photo so that I've got a good span from dark to light like this, obviously this doesn't look good because it's a night photo. However, if I increase the exposure a little bit, that's going to help bring out some of the Milky Way and some of the detail in the tufa while still letting the photo be dark overall, making it look like a night photo. Another thing you can do to really start to bring out the Milky Way and the stars without overly affecting your dark foreground is to play with your white slider. The more that you pull this up, the more it's going to make the night sky really pop in your photos. And the amount you do this is obviously up to your own personal taste. I might target something like that just to help bring out the stars and the Milky Way, but leave the ground dark so that it looks still like a nighttime photo. At this point, the exposure overall looks pretty good, and I want to start looking at the color. A lot of folks really like blue Milky Way photos because it feels a lot like night. And in fact, if I slide the white balance slider down, you can see something like this really feels like a nighttime photo. Now, personally, I don't like to do this because unless I'm specifically going for a monochromatic image, I like to have a nice variety of complementary colors throughout the color spectrum in my photo. So instead of targeting this super blue, cool night look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to aim for a white balance and a tint that gives me a very neutral color across the frame. And what that allows is all the individual colors from all the individual parts of the Milky Way to come out. So in this case, I'm going to warm it up. As I do that, you can see that the photo's taken on quite a green tint. So let me counterbalance that with some magenta. Like that. The sky's starting to look a little blue. So let's warm it up a little bit more. Just a little bit. And maybe a little bit more magenta. That's too much magenta and too warm. And I think something right about in there. Now I have a nice neutral. In fact, you can see the tufas themselves look very color neutral in this case, which is great. And if I look closely at my Milky Way, you can see I have a whole range of colors from warmer tones down here near the galactic center to cooler tones out here on the fringes. And I really like that. Those colors are going to start popping out when I increase the contrast and the saturation of this photo. With my color spectrum in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to increase some of the color density of the image. I'm just going to slide the vibrance and the saturation up a little bit. That's also going to help me figure out if my photo has a good color balance or if I need to do some fine tuning. You can see it's really started to bring out some of the blue and the purple tones here in the Milky Way. So maybe I still have a little bit too much magenta, and I'll dial that back a little bit. Now I want to really start to bring out some of the contrast and detail here in the Milky Way. And one way I can approach that is by increasing the clarity slider. However, you might not want to do that when it comes to your Milky Way images, because what clarity does is it adds local contrast. So everywhere around the tufa where you have kind of a hard edge, you might start to get haloing if you increase your clarity too much. So we're going to come back to that in a little bit. I'm going to show you a cool way that you can do that on the Milky Way. But for the time being, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the tone curve to start to separate some of the darker parts from some of the lighter parts of the Milky Way, and that's really just going to help the details pop. So if I grab my little targeted adjustment tool here, and I put it over one of the brighter parts of the Milky Way like that, and I'm going to drag that up, then I can put it over one of the darker parts of the Milky Way like this, and drag it down. And you see as I do this, this is really going to help things start to just jump out like crazy, bringing out all the nice structure in that Milky Way. Now obviously as I do this, this is going to affect the exposure and the tonal balance throughout the image. So I might make some micro adjustments to that in a little bit. For the time being, I'm really just looking at my Milky Way and how does it look. Maybe something like that looks pretty sweet. So at this point I'm going to jump back to my basic panel and see what happens if I pull up some of my shadows, just to get a little bit more detail back in those tufas. Now I don't necessarily want them too bright, because one, that's going to add a lot of noise to the image, and two, it's going to take away from the fact that this is a night photo, and I want these to be fairly dark overall. Maybe something like that. Now if parts of the Milky Way are starting to look a little bit too bright, what you can do is grab your highlight slider and drag those down a little bit to keep those in check. And overall I really like the way that the exposure of this photo is looking. It certainly looks like nighttime, but we can also see the vibrancy and the splendor of the Milky Way. At this point I want to look a little bit at some noise reduction, because if I zoom in you can see that there's quite a lot of noise throughout the image, especially here in the tufa, because they were so dark when I took this photo. Now I've used a lot of different kinds of noise reduction software over the years, a lot of different third-party plugins, and I've found that at least for Milky Way photos, my favorite kind of noise reduction is the native noise reduction here in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw. So if you go down here to your Detail tab, you'll find Luminance and Color Noise Reduction. For the Milky Way, I find that adding the color noise all the way up and putting the smoothness all the way up helps to minimize blobbiness and other weird color artifacts in the frame. You can see if I put that color smoothness back down, there's all these weird blobs of reds and oranges and greens and blues. But if I slide that up, it really helps smooth out the background in terms of the color. Now for the luminance noise, which is all that's left over, all this little grain matter in here, I find that a level of around 30 to 50, depending on how noisy your photo is a great way to pull out some of that grain within the photo. Now you don't want to go too high, otherwise it starts to really smooth out your image and give it a super unnatural look. But I find that somewhere in that 30 to 50 range works pretty well. And then you can play with your detail slider to have Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw try to recover any detail that you've smoothed out. And the same goes here for the contrast slider. I'm going to slide that up a little bit to try to bring back some of the contrast here within the tufa towers. Now if I turn this effect on and off up here at the top of the tab, you're going to see really what a dramatic difference it does to add all of that color noise reduction as well as the luminance noise reduction and the color smoothing. Now when I zoom back out, you'll see that things kind of look a little bit smoothed over and soft, and that's just the way that Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw renders the photo with that noise reduction. If you zoom back in, you can see you have all your detail here, and if you make a print out of this, for example, all the detail will be there in the print as well. So with our noise reduction in place, it's time to take a look at kind of the last thing that I mentioned in those 5 critical elements, which is bringing out the detail within the Milky Way. And I mentioned that I didn't want to do it via the clarity slider because it could potentially add halos throughout the image. But what we can do, if you hit the K on your keyboard, or you go up here and hit your adjustment brush, we can actually add clarity to just a small section of the photo. So pop that clarity up, grab yourself a nice soft brush, and just start painting over the Milky Way. Wherever you want the details to start to pop out. And you'll see if I turn this effect on and off now, it really helps bring out the stars there in the Milky Way and makes it super duper eye-catching. And obviously you can adjust that the more that you want to bring out the individual structures within the Milky Way. So now that the image is looking pretty nice overall, the last thing that I really want to do is take out this plane streak down here. So I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, hit the Q key to bring up my healing brush tool. Now, I'm just going to dial this down to a tiny little guy, draw over that plane. Now it's okay if you overlap into the tufa a little bit in a situation like this, because, well, in this case Lightroom did a great job of selecting source data, but had it not, well, you can always click and drag and pull that source information down somewhere along another, down here lower on the tufa, and so that it matches up and lines up really well. So now our plane is gone. Let me zoom back out here, and if I hit the Y key on my keyboard, you're going to see where we started and where we ended up. You can see that the image on the right just has so much more interest and vibrancy and beauty and color in it. But you've probably also noticed, as I've been zooming in and zooming out and bouncing around the photo, that these tufa towers are A, incredibly soft and out of focus, and B, they have a ton of noise, and C, there's no detail in them. So how do you deal with something like that? Well, that's what the subsequent parts of this video are going to be all about. I'm going to show you how you can take a photo from, say, twilight that you shot at a high F number and low ISO to get tons of good detail throughout those tufa towers and combine it so that it matches perfectly with this image, and you have a composite Milky Way photo that is the maximum amount of quality in the tufa towers and still has that beautiful Milky Way look there in the sky. So be sure to check out the next parts of the video. As always, thanks for watching. Hope you guys really enjoyed this and found some interesting and useful tips. Until next time, have fun and happy shooting.